Okay, perfect.
Okay, welcome Chinese psychologists to the second of 10 lectures sponsored by the Zhengdao Clinic. And we have 10 lectures, and these lectures will be interspersed with 10 more supervisions. We have 4 therapists who have agreed to present some of their work so that I can respond to it from a relational standpoint. And then we have a couple of sessions devoted entirely to questions and answers. And Zilly will tell you exactly how to get those questions to me so that we can have a rich discussion. So during the first lecture last week, I started off with the metaphor of imagining yourself in a large city square, waiting patiently for the unveiling of Picasso's last sculpture. And then, since there are people from all different angles, some people with cameras, some people with art pads, what we see depends on where we stand. What we see depends on who we are and what our purpose for being there is. And so as we use this metaphor to begin thinking about psychotherapy and psychology, we begin to realize how important the notion of perspective turns out to be. For many years, since Newton in the 16th century began the scientific revolution, Newton, as I mentioned last week, felt that the universe was a giant clockwork set into motion by the hand of God, and our job was to systematically understand every piece of how the universe worked. And that view of science prevailed up through the 19th century as the major way of thinking about and studying the world around us. And it's now been called the modern view. However, starting with Einstein in 1905, and then followed by the quantum physicist, the string theorist, and many other, the chaos theorists, we've begun to realize that the world is not so simple that we will ever be able to understand it, that the universe is in principle infinitely complex and forever unknowable. And so this is the postmodern view. The postmodern view says we'll never know how things work, but what we need to do is to form models or perspectives or vantage points on things we want to look at, on things we want to study and to understand. And so in psychology and psychotherapy, the perspectives that we want to develop are perspectives on what we want to listen to in therapy to the human beings that come to our consulting room. And so then we begin to think, well, in psychotherapy, what's the most important dimension? Now, more than 100 years ago, Freud was using the modern approach, and he began to search for things in the human mind, such as conscious and unconscious, or ids and egos and superegos. And so all of early psychoanalysis and most psychologies were formed trying to find out what's the truth of the human mind, until at last we've begun to realize that whatever truths there are in the human mind, that our mind is the most complex thing in the known universe, and in principle, it is forever also unknown and unknowable. So we're stuck with trying to understand people who come to our consulting rooms and trying to develop perspectives that will help us listen carefully to them and listen carefully to the things that are bothering them. And I don't have to tell you, everyone who comes to our consulting room today, the first thing on their mind is relationships, whether it's with a spouse, a child, a mother, the past, and relationships are really what our lives are about. So then last week, we also talked then about that we now know through neuroscience that the human brain, the forebrain particularly, organizes itself in the first year of life according to the relationships that are and are not available. That is, always before we thought the brain was just something, and we would input and we'd learn about it. Now we know that it's much more complex than that. And every human brain is different because every environment of each individual baby is different. And so if the baby gets one kind of mirroring or one kind of interaction, then the brain, the cells actually move around in the brain to accommodate that relationship. The principle that has been spoken of is by a neuroscientist named Hebb. It's called the Hebbian principle. And it's a principle that says when neurons wire together because there's something in the environment they want to investigate, when they fire together, they also wire together. And at that point in time, there's a new connection. And so during the 9 months in utero and the next 3 or 4 months after birth, what is happening is babies' minds are being organized and their brains are actually changing and moving in order to accommodate the learning process that relationships provide them. So we can see that the earliest relationships are the most important ones. But then in our postmodern view of psychotherapy, where we're trying to develop perspectives that would help us most help our patients, we begin to find out that the relationships that all of us form in the course of growing up are the most important thing to focus on. And so the relational approach has been evolving now for several decades. And it's not that it's new, but it's becoming clarified. It's becoming articulated in a number of different places. So the idea is this, that our relationships form our brain, and then we interact with the environment, and there is a progression of complexity in terms of the kinds of interactions that human beings are able to have. And the progression is from simple connections to more complex, more complex, more complex, and very complex. And so it's not like there's a lockstep developmental procedure, because there isn't. Every baby, every person develops differently. But we can define a series of relationship complexities that help us listen to people in our consulting rooms. And so today I'm going to be spending most of the time talking about these particular relationship complexities. And it's going to be important for you to get these in your mind, because the rest of the course is going to be built on these. And I will be repeating them, as we go each time. But I'll have some charts I'll show you today. And at first, it seems overwhelming because I've got 3 or 4 charts that are all sort of along the same dimension. And you think there's too much to learn, there's too much to remember. But at some point you begin to realize, wait a minute, there's nothing new here. We've all been through all kinds of relationships in the course of our life. And so this is simply an organizing of the relational dimension that we all know about and live with. I want to start today's lecture with a quote from an American psychologist, psychoanalyst, Roy Schaefer. And he wants to outline the seeds and the forerunners of the relational approach. And in a later section, I'll go back and show actually the relational approach started with Sigmund Freud in 1895. And so we'll be looking at what is the relational approach. Now, there's several important things about this approach. First of all, this is not another theory of psychotherapy or how to do psychotherapy. You've all been trained and you've chosen the theory and the techniques that make sense to you, that work for you. That's what we do. We have a lot of different schools of psychology, schools of psychotherapy. And so we learn one and then maybe we learn another. this is not another school of psychotherapy, but rather it's an approach that is useful to all psychotherapies. That is, it's because the human mind is organized according to relationships, then as we begin to understand the progression of complexity of relationships, it will help us no matter what form of psychotherapy we practice. So, Roy Schaefer, I'm going to quote him here. He says, dialogue and intersubjectivity have been moving to the center of psychoanalytic interest for many years. To put it briefly, dialogue conveys the idea that in the course of psychotherapy, the understandings and the changes that take place can only come about through an evolving dialogue between the therapist and the patient. In other words, the definition of reshaping the self and the other only takes place in a verbal and nonverbal dialogue. So again, he's saying something that we know perfectly well, but he's saying it in a very simple way, that it's the back and forth dialogue between the therapist and the patient that leads to whatever it is that's change and that's beneficial. It's a creation of a relational situation which people find helpful. Then he goes on to define or talk about intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, tells us started in ancient Greece, but only has been thought about recently in the last century in Western thought. I'm a subject, the owner of my world of ideas and feelings, and you are a subject, the owner of your world and feelings. But when you and I get together and begin an exchange, something else begins to happen as our two worlds begin to go back and forth and begin to intermingle. And what happens is there's a culture of two minds that begins to develop, and we call this culture the intersubjective matrix. Some psychoanalysts call it the third force. That is, there's you, me, and the connection between us would be the third. And so intersubjectivity implies that two minds are coming together, they're cross-fertilizing each other, and after they've come together, some entirely new things evolve. So Roy Schaefer says, and intersubjectivity conveys the embeddedness of each person's cognitive and emotional position and his or her dialogic orientation in so-called real or imagined relations with others. So he's saying is you and I get together and we exchange these things cognitively and emotionally, then that as a result of that dialogue and that conversation, our inner world changes. He continues to say it's always been intuited and vaguely understood that the agent of change in psychotherapy is the dialogic nature and the intersubjective reach of the therapeutic relationship itself. And this has become increasingly clear to us in the last 2 to 3 decades, when the relational understanding has begun to become articulated by different therapists in different places. We've begun to realize that whatever it is that's important in human relationships emerges through interpersonal dialogues. Another group that has thought about this considerably is called the Boston Change Process Study Group. Boston, as in Boston, Massachusetts, where this is a group of infant researchers, but they were interested in studying the change process. How is it that human beings change? And they were studying infants and mothers in the earliest months and years of life to look for an understanding of what the change process is in human relationships. And the most startling thing that came out of this, many things have come out of this study, but one of the most important ones is the concept of the present moment. This moment we have right now, you and me together. And so the person that's written about it clearly is Donald Spence, and he's an infant researcher, and Daniel Spence, sorry. And here's the idea. I'm going to read it, just a few comments to you. The ongoing intimate relationships, in the ongoing intimate relationships that we have with important people, ordinary present moments, now, 3 minutes from now, 5 minutes from now, present moments, just a moment in time, present moments often move towards special now moments that threaten the status quo of the relationship and the intersubjective field as it is mutually created and accepted up until then. Let's see, I'm thinking I'm gonna, Sammy, I'm gonna use you to talk to here. As you and I are having a present moment right now, okay, I say something and you say something, and I say something else and you say something else. Before too long, we're talking, and then we bump into something. Call it an incomplete understanding, or a difference of opinion, or a different choice of words. But we run into it, and he calls those now moments, when they're not just present, but now moments when you and I are bumping heads. And what are we going to do? And so we find a way to resolve those now moments, because they present a crisis in us, and the crisis between our differences here needs some kind of resolution. So the way I'm quoting him here, now moments represent a relationship crisis that needs a resolution. And then he goes on to say, a moment of meeting. So we've now got now moments to start with. We've got, I'm sorry, present moments to start with. Then as we go forward, we've got now moments. And now there's going to be a moment of meeting. And that's when Sammy and I have an authentic and well-fitted response to the crisis created by the now moment. Perhaps we had a difference of opinion about something. Perhaps we use different words or different concepts. But as we talk a minute, then suddenly we got it and we're there, and it's a moment of meeting. Okay? If two people are successful in their moment of meeting, the relationship builds and both people are slightly changed. That is, the moment of meeting actually allows two people to know something about each other that they didn't know before. If the meetings of moment are not successful, then we have a bigger rupture and a bigger rupture. And finally, Sammy and I are not even going to talk to each other. We hate each other so much. Okay, we're going to get divorced. Okay, so the question is, relationships build on the basis of now moments coming together, working together to learn from each other, and then moving forward to the next set of puzzling moments. So the lesson is clear, says Schaefer, Spence, whatever importantly motivates us in relationships is operating in the here and now present moment and deserves our mutual attention and focus. And this will not come surprise to any of us, but particularly not to us who have been trained as therapists, because we know we are listening every moment to what's being said to us. And we're looking for one of those moments in which we could have a now moment and begin to have a moment of meeting. We're trained to look for that. If we cannot live together in the present moment, our relationships are dragged down by the past or weighed down by anxieties of the future, neither of which we can do anything about in the present moment. Now, to me, the most fascinating thing that came out of the study of the present moment, Spence, in studying this, although the group is from Boston, he was living in Manhattan, New York, and he began to study. He went down to Lower Manhattan, which is an artsy section, and he spent a lot of time in dance studios. And then he went to music studios and music schools, and he listened to dance and music, and he finally decided that the present moment is about 6 or 7 seconds long. 6 or 7 seconds long. Now, if you remember in your beginning psychology books, there was a set of studies about how we see. And in the set of studies, there are pictures given to the subject, and cameras focus on the eye movements of the subject as the subject looks at the pictures and takes pictures of what, and we think we see in a panorama, but the experiments showed that we do not, that we see in momentary fixations. Our eyes focus here, 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 here. And of course, some of the more interesting pictures were naked people. And obviously the sexual parts were the parts that all the eyes kept focusing back on. But the point is, we don't see a smooth panorama. Our brains put these various fixation points together, giving us the illusion that we see things continuously. Now we can see that our present moments operate the same way. That Sammy and I have one present moment here, and then quickly we're shifted and we're both in another present moment, and then another one and another one. But we think we've been sitting here having a continuous conversation. And the important part of this for us as psychotherapists is to realize that when we're in a conversation with any of our clients, many different things are going on with eyes. I assume we're going to hear something about ears, but I don't know that research yet. But certainly our brains integrate our experiences and give us the sense of who we are and who the other person is. And in these present moments of fixation, we're constantly creating relationships. And that's really the important part that we need to begin to realize, that an infant from conception begins creating a relationship with the womb. And once the placenta is attached, the placenta and the baby begin to blood flow from the mother, nutrients, evacuation. And so for 9 months, there's this complex relationship between a fetus and mother's body. And we now know that in the last trimester, and maybe before, babies are paying close attention to what's going on around them. We begin to discover this with audiology, and microphones were actually put into women's wombs to measure the kinds of sounds that the babies were hearing. And so the sounds are very distinct. So by the time a baby is born, the sounds, the movement, the routines of mother and mother's body are already known to the baby. So babies come in to the world already having mapped many things. And in the next 3 months, which infant researchers have called the 4th trimester, which I pointed out is a strange thing. In English and Latin, tri means 3. So we ordinarily think of 3, but the infant researchers say there's another 3 months after that, and we're going to call it the 4th trimester. So during this 4th trimester, babies are still mapping, but they're mapping different things. They're mapping mother's face, mother's arms, everything around them. They're sleeping most of the time. They wake up, they nurse, and then after a satisfying nursing, you watch a baby and they begin to look around, and they're looking all over the place until suddenly something catches their attention. And our research has told us it's almost always something round, and it's almost always something with sharp edges. That is, babies are genetically prepared to recognize faces and to pick faces out of the environment. And if we are there as a parent or a friend, we wait for the baby to wake up. We wait for the baby to be satisfied at the breast. And then we wait until the baby's eyes focus on us and we light up and we start talking and we maybe sing a little song and we move around and we're catching the baby's attention. We're drawing this baby towards us. Heinz Kohut, the person we associate with self-psychology, says babies form a self because mother believes there is a self, and she addresses the baby as if the baby had a self. And so the mother is pulling that baby into selfhood through this relationship. And I continue, of course, to talk about mother, but where it's all mothering people in the environment, fathers, brothers, sisters, grandmothers, it doesn't matter. Whoever is there, whoever is emotionally involved in this baby, including the family dog or cat, they're very interested in babies. Whoever is there, the baby then begins to have a special relationship with them. And that becomes a little later stage. But in this first stage, the baby is simply trying to map what's out there anyway. And so, as I said, the mapping starts from conception. It takes intense change at birth. And then by the fourth month, the baby is now alive to the world and moving and doing things. And parents are, by the fourth month, the parents are very tired. Their bags under their eyes from staying up so late. They're worn out. They think, will this baby never grow up? But finally, by the fourth month, oh, do you know what he did today? He smiles when I smiled at him. There's a baby in there. And so we welcome this child into our world. It's the baby has been entering our world for a solid year, but we can now feel that baby's presence in a very real psychological way. So now as we move forward in this, the dimension that we're going to be watching for the 22 sessions that we're going to have, the dimension is going to be the dimension of relational complexity. Babies begin very simple, more complex, more complex. And so all of the charts we're going to see will be charting that relational dimension. Now, be careful. There's a tendency to look at these charts as though they are developmental phases, and that babies go through one phase and then the next, and then the next, and the next. We've had plenty of those developmental phases. Relational complexities are something else entirely. We all live through, there's four major watersheds of relational complexity. We'll look at them. We all live in all four of those complexity levels every day. That is, sometimes we live very primitive things, like when we're laughing or having a good time, or maybe when we're in bed with a lover, where we're just ecstatic, we're going crazy, and we're just enjoying ourselves fully. But then by the time we get up to the highest of these four levels, these are some of our most difficult times of the day, because at these higher levels, we realize we have to consider other people. We have to pay attention to the feelings of our partner, to the feelings of our child. We need to slow down what we want and allow ourselves to be present with a partner, a lover, a patient. And those are our most difficult times during the day, but they represent the most complex forms of relationships. Okay, now I'm going to go through them. Don't get overwhelmed, okay? I'm going to take them slow. We're going to go back over these again and again in different contexts, and then we're going to see them applied in the supervision, okay? So right now, we're just going to look at them, and let's see. Let me get this up on the screen for you. Okay. I was so glad Sammy showed me what my name looks like in Chinese. You know, it looks like Chinese to me, right? Okay. All right. So this is the relational approach to psychotherapy. And I have on these slides, and so that you'll have them, contact information for me. You can phone, email, you can go to my website. But this is the contact information for me, and I'm sure you'll have access to these slides at some point. There's a website I wanted you to have. I gave it to you last week. It's a website of the International Psychotherapy Institute. It's their free psychotherapy books website. And on that website, there's now about 150 free download psychotherapy books by major writers in the field. And you just have to go and register yourself and then download them. And the registration is just so the website can keep track of where these books are going. They're now being sent to 98 countries. There's over 2 million copies of these free books circulating in the world. And you'll be interested to know that Google is putting out $50,000 a year to support this website. Google likes to have free things. And so that's there. Now, I have about 20 of my books on this free website. And at this point in time, most of my books on this website are also available on Amazon, and they're $19 a piece. I've lowered the price on them so people could have access to them. So I wanted you to have that website because there's wonderful resources for you there. And some of you I know are already teachers or going to be teachers, and you may find some very good textbooks there. So make use of this website. All right. I told you we've got 4. And these charts are all going to be read from the bottom first, because we're going to look at from birth. And the first, Roman 1, is the organizing experience or the psychotic experience. And the dates on that are plus or minus 4 months from birth, as I've already said. That is, this organizing or psychotic experience goes on in utero and then on for the first 3 or 4 months of life. And we're going to talk about what goes on in the organizing experience and what that relational experience is like. The second level goes from roughly 4 to 24 months. But time periods are arbitrary, but they just help us get a picture. This we call the symbiotic period or the bonding experience. It's the period that attachment theory deals with. And at this point in time, most of the clients coming to us in private practice are going to be concerned particularly about these 2 levels of themselves, whether they have developed the other 2 or not. So most of our attention in this course is going to be spent on these 2 levels because they turn out to be the most practical level. Like I say, even if people have developed other higher levels or more complex levels, these are the levels that give people problems. The third level is the self-other, or Kohut's term is self-object, or the narcissistic experience. This is the 3-year-old experience of see me, say how wonderful I am, watch me dance, listen to me sing, look at my drawing. That is, the self is using others to reinforce the self. And we'll talk about all of that. And that's about the 3rd year. Then Along about 4 to 7, we have then what has been called the normal or neurotic experience of independence. That is, once a child has developed a solid self, the child then becomes aware of his or her independence and then becomes aware of independent relationships with other selves. So this is the period that started psychoanalysis with Sigmund Freud, the so-called Oedipal period. That is, during Freud's own self-analysis, as he began to study triangles in his life, triangle relationships in his life, he began to realize that the myth of Oedipus, 5,000 years old, was studying the triangles all of these years, and that then when Sophocles in 429 wrote the play Oedipus Rex, that was 429 BC, and then Hamlet carries on the same kind of themes. And so Freud felt, since he was experiencing it, and since this myth was so ancient, that there's something about three-way relationships that's really important to the human being. And while we no longer are too interested in the myth of Oedipus, what we are interested in is the child who moves from the solid self, independent, to the capacity to have independent triangles, classically mother, father, and me. But it's any three in the child's life, including brothers, sisters, grandmothers, nursery school teachers. And so the question is, how does a child learn the complex relationship? And the example that I gave last week was that, well, just if Zilli is my father and Sammy is my mother, I have to relate to one of them, my mother, in one way without my father, and I have to relate to my father in another way without my mother. But when the three of us together, it's very complex what goes on, okay? So I want to move on to these. Let's see. Okay, I want to just tell you these charts are going to get complex. And so you can see here the four red ones are the four experiences. And then now what we begin to realize when we look at relational fears, there are different fears associated with each level of complexity and development. And we'll look at those fears as we go on. So again, as you kind of think about this and study it, it's good to begin getting some of these things in your mind. And then you can see we're going to get far more complex. This is the same chart. You can see on the left-hand side, the organizing, symbiotic, self-consolidating, and the independent. But we're going to be looking for it later on. First of all, what's the developmental thrust? What's going on in this? Then how is it going to show up in the transference? How is it going to show up in the countertransference? And then this chart has oops, let's see, it went too fast. This chart has a second part. Oh, this is the second part. Here again, the four levels, but we're going to look at resistance in therapy. We're going to look at our best way to listen to each of these four levels and our best way to intervene therapeutically in each of these four levels. So you can see this is not another theory about how to work in therapy. It's rather a set of understandings about when people are relating to us from certain levels of complexity, how are we going to be present with them? This book is now, this next year will be its 40th anniversary. It's now up on my website for $19. It's also up on the free website. It's my first book, 1983, and it gives these listening perspectives in great detail. It's my most difficult book to read because I set about to survey 100 years of psychoanalysis in terms of relationships. And so it's a book of scholarship. The rest of them I sort of shoot from the hips more. And one of the more recent ones that summarizes this whole approach, that's very readable. In fact, I wrote it for Chinese students at Kappa. It's a short book on the handbook that summarizes all of this. And I recommend that you each one get this handbook, and as you go through, you'll begin to see that we're repeating, and repeating, but each time we repeat, there's something other complex about it. So very quickly, I want to go through the organizing experience. Let's see, we're doing good with time. All right, I'm going to read this slowly because it's taken us years to get it condensed into a couple of statements. So the organizing experience. Infants require certain forms of connection and interconnection in order to remain psychologically alert and enlivened to themselves and to others. And I gave that example of the baby waking up, nursing, and then trying to find the world. What we know is all mammals are genetically prepared with a demand. And the demand for all mammals, and we are mammals, is find the warm body or die. But with human beings, it's more than find the warm body. We are genetically prepared for the last 3 or 4 million years to find the human mind. And so babies, when they're born, are genetically prepared to find mother's body, mother's breast, mother, and then standing behind mother, the baby will find the father, and then the family, and then the tribe, and then the church, the religion, the culture, the language. All of these things have been evolving for thousands of years, and babies are genetically prepared to look for them and to find them. And so this relational dimension that we're looking at is a relational dimension that is genetically foreordained to move forward. And this is the way it starts, that the baby realizes that the baby must reach out and find a connection and an interconnection in order to remain psychologically enlivened to themselves. Okay. In an early relatedness, babies then are busy organizing physical and mental channels of connection, first to mother's body and later to her mind, and then to the minds of others. And these connections are for nurturance, stimulation, evacuation, soothing, and finally, becoming a real human being. Now, when we frame organizing patterns in psychotherapy, okay, I'm going to be talking about framing each one of these experiences, how, as we're in psychotherapy and we begin to realize someone is trying to reach out, trying to connect to us, but they're afraid. Okay, so framing organizing patterns for analysis entails studying how two people approach each other, you and your client, to make connections, and then turn away, veer off, rupture or dissipate the intensity of the connections. That is, if there's been a trauma at this organizing level, the child is afraid of connections. So the child is caught with a genetic demand to find a connection, and yet the child has learned, if I connect to her, I will be hurt. I will be left alone to die. I will be injured in some way or another. And we're going to talk about all the ways in which people and our patients have experienced trauma during this early organizing period. And so they have to reach out because their genes tell them to reach out, but their traumatic experiences tell them to shut down. And so what we're doing when we're trying to frame this in our therapy session, we're studying those moments in which the patient tries to reach us and then quickly veers away, shuts down. And we're going to watch this happen in the course of the patients that we're going to study through the supervision. And let's see. All right, let's see. Okay, now I told you there's fears associated with each one of these. And so there's going to be two different fears or two perspectives associated here. Don't get confused by having so many little pieces. At some point, it'll just flow together and you'll see, aha. So infants are programmed genetically in many ways to reach out to the human environment for stimulation, nurture, soothing, and evacuation. But when an infant repeatedly reaches out in whatever way is possible and the environment is unresponsive, the infant's reaching slumps and withers, thus forming an internalized habit of painful inhibition and withdrawal. And so what's established in that baby at that point is the fear of being alone. Now, this is not the fear of being abandoned, that's later. This is the fear of being taken into the forest and left to die. We dread reaching out and finding there's nobody there to respond to our needs. We fear being ignored, being left alone, and being seen as unimportant. We feel the world does not respond to our needs, so what's the use? And we have all of these myths around the world of a child being left by the parents in the woods to die. The parents didn't want the child, didn't want to connect to the child. And so this also happens at home when the child has needs and the parents fail to respond. So the second part of this organizing experience is reaching out to make connections. Like I said, infants are genetically programmed for bonding and attachment through mutual affective regulation with their caregivers. When they reach out and experience rejection or injury, they quickly learn to never reach that way again. That is, if you're reaching out and nobody's there, or you get slapped, you pull back and you don't reach again. And so the fear that's associated with this is because of frightening and painful experience in the past, connecting emotionally and intimately with others feels dangerous and potentially hurtful. Our painful life experiences have left us feeling that the world is not a safe place. We fear injury, so we withdraw from connections. I'm sorry, I failed to give you that second slide. You'll get all of these slides and you can go through them carefully. And they're all expanded considerably in that relational listing handbook I mentioned to you. The second experience, 4 to 24 months, is going to be the symbiotic relational experience. Toddlers are busy learning how to make emotional relationships, good and bad, that's the splitting, work for them. They experience a sense of merger and reciprocity with their primary caregivers, thus establishing many knee-jerk, automatic, characterological, and role reversal patterns or scenarios of relatedness. That is, in the attachment, babies learn to be together with their mom. As you watch my hands, you can see we're going back and forth and learning to be with each other. And so often then the experience is one of mother and baby operating as one, which is why it's gotten called the symbiosis. Now, in human life, there's no such thing as symbiosis. That's a metaphor borrowed from biology. But Margaret Mahler felt that the experience that a mother and a baby were having during this period is as though they're operating with one mind. And so when we feel that a patient is relating to us out of a symbiosis, either a good symbiosis or a bad symbiosis, we frame the symbiotic or bonding attachment relatedness scenarios. We note how each person, you and me, characteristically engage the other emotionally, and how interactive scenarios evolve from two subjectively formed sets of internalized self and object interaction patterns. So going back to intersubjectivity, Sammy has her own life history. She has her own ways that she likes to connect with people. She has her own ways that she doesn't like to connect with people. And I have mine. And so when we come together and try to match, we'll each one be trying to experience an appreciation of the other person's world or trying to move comfortably. And so in psychotherapy, we're aware that our borderline and characterological patients generally come in from this level, and they try to set up the same kind of reaction patterns that they've learned as babies, and we feel awkward about it. We feel pressured. We feel our boundaries are being put upon, and then after a while, we begin to feel like there's something wrong here, and we begin to realize this person is showing me what their early bonding pattern was. And then we'll go through and try to talk about how we work with this. So that framing for therapeutic study, the symbiotic bonding or attachment relatedness scenarios, the back and forth scenarios, entails noting how each person characteristically engages the other emotionally, and how interactive scenarios back and forth evolve from two subjectively formed sets of internalized self and other interaction patterns. So you can see here something that we'll clarify later, that when we're interacting with this level of relatedness with our client, we are ourselves interacting at our very early symbiotic level in order to be able to do this dance and then define that the dance isn't working. So there's much more of us involved in these two lower levels of relatedness than there is at the upper levels. And that'll become clear why. But the simple answer is that in the first 2.5 years of life, babies don't have speech and stories. Yes, they're learning words, but their experiences are not yet involved in telling you what's going on or telling you stories about what happened. And so the communication between caregivers and babies and toddlers is emotional communication, is interaction communication. And so when we're working with people for the time that are living at this level, then we're going to feel that bonding dance being done. Now, there's one other very important thing to be aware of as we go through here, and I've already hinted at it, which is all of us went through all 4 levels of relational development, and all of us relate in all 4 of those levels. And so in our own analysis, when we're in therapy, we may be very well developed. Most of us who have gone this far in school and in our own therapy, we're fairly well developed people, but at some point, there may be some pieces of our history, either in the first year or 2 of life or the 3rd year of life, there may be pieces of us that had some kind of interruption or trauma. And in the middle of our analysis at our upper levels, we will have to go and explore what those early scenarios were all about. So this not only applies, the 4 dimensions, not only apply to people who are sort of stuck living at those dimensions, but they apply to all of us when there are pieces of ourselves that had some trauma at some of those levels. And so the next part is still part of the symbiotic experience, but it's the end of the symbiotic experience. So the attachment or bonding through symbiosis, through mutual affect regulation, it's a fundamental biological drive. Babies are driven to bond emotionally with their mothers. This often other bonding scenarios or dances established are life-sustaining. Being able to find one's bonding partners is being unable to find one's bonding partners is terrifying and disorienting. So the fear is then the fear of being abandoned. And I said, this is different than the first fear, which is the fear of being alone. This is the fear of after having attached that you can't find the other. So after having connected emotionally or bonded or attached with someone in some way, we fear either being abandoned with our own needs or being swallowed up by the other person's needs. In either case, we feel the world is not a safe or dependable place and that we live in danger of emotional abandonment. We may become clingy and dependent, or we may become super independent, or both. Okay. I realize there's a lot of things coming at you. This is the first sweep. I want to remind you, we're going to keep going through these until we understand how they live in us and live in other people. So the fourth perspective is reaching out to assert ourselves. This is towards the end of the symbiosis. Human babies are not only pre-programmed to emotionally resonate and attach to humans, they're also pre-programmed to push away from the attachment figure in search of independence. And the research about this has been very interesting, but every mother knows it. Along in the second year of life somewhere, the baby begins saying no. Here in English, mothers call this the terrible twos. When babies become rebellious, when babies refuse to do what they know they're supposed to be doing and begin fighting with mother about it. So human babies are not only pre-programmed to emotionally resonate and attach, they're pre-programmed to push away in search of independence. When a child's attempts at self-assertion and separation individuation are thwarted, not allowed by the mothering people, frustration and anger usually results. Anger that may get severely squelched. So there's many parents, mothers that don't understand the baby's need for independence. They don't understand the baby's need to say no. And so instead of negotiating with the baby around yes and no, or I want this and you want that, instead of negotiating, they squelch and force the baby to do it their way. And that leaves characterological difficulties, it leaves borderline difficulties. The fear associated with self-assertion, pushing away from mother. We've all experienced rejection and punishment for expressing ourselves in opposition to others. We come to fear asserting ourselves and our needs in relationship. We feel the world does not allow us to be truly ourselves. So we may either cease putting ourselves out there, or we may assert ourselves with a demanding, aggressive vengeance. Okay. And so that's really the two aspects of the attachment. There's the attachment and connection, and the detachment and self-assertion. So we just have a few more minutes left, and then I'm going to go for questions. We're now moving up to the third year of life, to what is called the self-other or self-object relational experience. 3-year-olds now have individuated from mother. They've gone over this fight with mother. By the way, one of the things that's amazing to mothers is, and I've been with a lot of mothers where they had really difficult, terrible twos with their babies, they're screaming and yelling at one another, fighting at one another. And then as soon as the mother begins to relax and negotiate with the baby, at some point overnight, the baby stops being mean and nasty and oppositional. And the way I've come to understand that is that the baby needs to know that my opinions, when I need them, will be respected. And so as long as mother's negotiating, sometimes mother can say, no, we're doing it my way. And the baby just goes. But at other times, there's a negotiation. And as soon as the baby begins to realize I can assert myself and I can be heard and respected, then the baby stops fighting mother. So But in this third year of life, the 3-year-olds are preoccupied with using acceptance and approval of others for developing and enhancing self-definitions, self-skills, self-cohesion, and self-esteem. Children are busy drawing or throwing a ball or dancing in the living room when the relatives have arrived. And everybody needs to be applauding them, saying, that's great, that's wonderful, you're great, you're my boy, I'm proud of you. Everything you do is wonderful. And that's the way we begin to develop a good, strong sense of self, is by being seen, appreciated, respected by other people. And that's a necessary form of a 3-year-old development. And Heinz Kohut, who has helped us understand this level, also says we have narcissistic needs throughout our lives. That is, our need for approval from others never leaves us from birth to death. It's just that we learn how to manage it more comfortably. But 3-year-olds are preoccupied with it. So their relatedness strivings use the admiring, confirming, and idealized responses of significant others to firm up their budding sense of self. So framing for analysis in therapy, the self-other patterns used for affirming, confirming, and inspiring entails how the internalized mirroring, twinning, and idealizing patterns used in self-development in the past of both participants, play out to enhance and limit the possibilities for mutual self-to-self-other resonance in the emerging interpersonal engagement. Now, as I told you, most of our focus during this course is going to be on the first 2 levels of development, because these are the most difficult to understand. We will talk about this independent self level some, and we will also talk about the 4th level. Let's see. I'm sorry. Let me do the fears here, and I'll just go right here to the 5th, relational fear. When we do not get the acceptance and confirmation that we need, and at times inspiration that we need, all of these in order to develop a strong, healthy sense of self. When we don't give that, we may then feel let down, disappointed, and so a fear of lack of recognition. Let's see. All right, when we do not get the acceptance and confirmation we need in relationships, we're left with a feeling of not being seen or not being recognized for who we really are. We may then fear we will not be affirmed or confirmed in our relationships, or we may fear that others will only respect and love us if we are who they want us to be. We may work continuously to feel seen and recognized by others, or we may give up in rage, humiliation, or shame that we have such narcissistic needs, or we may deny the need completely through grandiosity. When we talk a little bit later about therapy with this level of self-object needs, I specifically address women therapists in terms of this is very difficult in the countertransference for women therapists to deal with men who are narcissistic. And the reason is because every woman on the planet has had the experience of being neglected, put down, abused, whatever, by narcissistic men who have no respect. And so every woman carries inside herself certain emotional sensitivities. So when a narcissistic man comes as a patient, it sometimes stirs up a lot of countertransference in women. Not that it doesn't in men, but I think women have a special vulnerability. And we'll talk about how the woman therapist can move past this to be able to appreciate that she's dealing not with another abusive man, she's dealing with a needy 3-year-old child. Okay, and that helps a lot. The last one, and then we'll go to questions and answers. This is the 4 and 5-year-old and beyond. They're dealing with triangular love and hate relationships and are moving towards more complex social relationships. And the reason, of course, Freud was enamored with the Oedipus myth was because Oedipus loved his mother and hated and killed his father. And then in the so-called negative Oedipus, the boy child falls in love with his father and hates his mother. And Freud didn't really deal much with women's triangulations. Carl Jung did, and he talked about the Electra complex, and that's very interesting. But the important thing isn't those, what it's called. The important thing is triangles are difficult, and the children do not have the capacity to work effectively considering each member of the triangle until they're at least 4, 5, and 6. Okay. In their relatedness, they experience others as separate centers of initiative, separate selves, and they experience themselves as independent agents, independent selves in a socially cooperative and competitive environment. So that's the meaning of this particular level. There's competition and cooperation among 3, framing the internalized patterns of independently interacting selves in both their cooperative and competitive triangulations with real and fantasy third parties entails studying the emerging interaction patterns in the therapy for evidence of repressive forces operating within each participant between the analytic couple that work to limit or spoil the full interactive potential. That is, all of us are perfectly capable of various kinds of repression, and just as our patients are. And so part of framing this is beginning to look at the ways in which we as a therapist are defensive and the ways that our patients are defensive in this way. So there's 2 different fears associated with, and the first one is the one, let's see, the fear of, let's see, the 6th fear, the fear of failure and success. Let's see, I got lost here. Go to the bottom part here. This is going to be the first fear at this level. When we've loved and lost in a triangle, or when we tried to love and failed, we may fear opening ourselves up to painful, competitive experiences again. When we've succeeded or won in a triangle, possibly at someone else's expense, we may experience guilt, or we may experience fear of retaliation. Thus, we learn to hold back in love and life, thereby not risking either failure or success in relationships. We may feel the world does not allow us to be fulfilled, or we may feel guilty or afraid for feeling fulfilled. And this is the defensive fear that Freud first labeled neurosis. The second fear stems out of that, but perhaps doesn't reach its apex until adolescence. As children learn to experience love and hate, as well as success and failure in triangular relationships, they're prepared for a cascade of triangular relationships in their early life, and then particularly when they're met as one moves into puberty and adolescence towards creative group living. And here they're fueled by the sex and aggressive hormones. And so by the fear then is our expansiveness, our creative energy, and our joy in aliveness inevitably come into conflict with demands from family, work, religion, culture, and society. So as very young children and babies, we learn to just be spontaneous and to be ourselves. But slowly through time, we begin to curtail who we were. We begin to become afraid that if we were, various things would happen. And reaches its pinnacle at adolescence. We come to believe that we must curtail our aliveness in order to be able to conform to the demands and the expectations of the world we live in and the people that are close to us. We feel the world does not permit us to be fully, joyfully, and passionately alive. Rather, that putting our whole selves out there with full energy and aliveness, rather than we may throw in the towel and succumb to mediocre conformity or fall into a living deadness. So in a way, if we had to say what the final goal of all therapies, relationally speaking, it's to be able to move to a level in which we are as fully alive and fully creative as we possibly can be. And yet we're aware that all of these levels of experience and all of these fears have severely limited us. And one of the things that's, for me, sad to see is when a child reaches 5, 6, or 7, this child that's been fully free, spontaneous, joyous, slowly begins to clamp down on herself or himself, and it loses that joyful spontaneity of early childhood as the child grows up. It's a necessary part of growing up. It's a necessary part of learning language and culture. It's a necessary part of creative development, of creative relationships with others. But there's something that's always sad to me about how much inhibition we had to put on ourselves growing up and how much defensiveness. And when I watched my own daughter growing up, I was already a psychoanalyst. And she was beautiful and lovely and excited and creative. And I knew that by the time she got 4, 5, and 6, sort of the lid was going to come down on that as a necessary part of developing on inner life. So those are the lecture pieces that I have for today. And Samuel, will you take over and help us with the question and answer session?
No problem. So we can start the Q&A right now.
Okay.
OK， 好，我们现在可以开始 Q&A 了。
那我来先问一个吧。那个，老师的书上和讲座上反复讲到的这个 organizing experience， 这个 organizing 它到底是什么意思？因为这个词翻译成中文以后，它是有很多意思的。能请老师多说一下吗？
And Julie is wondering, for the organizing experience, this term you have been constantly using in the book, in the context. So he actually wants you to clarify whether or not to clarify the real meaning of organizing experience, because when we're trying to translate it into Chinese, it can mean many, many different things.
Okay. Thank you, Zoe. Organizing can be many things in English too. All right. Actually, it's very simple. We're thinking about a baby in a womb, and in that last trimester, the baby is trying to organize her world. That is, there's certain times when mother's body goes to sleep, certain times when food begins to come, certain times when loud noises occur. And if her parents are fighting, she gets used to the fights and the tension of mother's body, gets used to mother's anxiety. So the baby is organizing a map that tells her about mother's body and the experiences that are coming through mother's body. That's in the last trimester. Then in the 4th trimester, the 3 or 4 months after birth, okay, the child is then organizing her world around her. And she sees a brother that she begins to relate to, a grandmother she begins to relate to. Every now and then the dog peeks his head over and barks. And so she's got to get used to the family dog. So it's organizing a world, organizing a map of the world that is meaningful to that particular baby. And so that you can see, Zilly, that every baby is going to organize their world entirely differently. And since the primal maps are there, then all subsequent relational experiences will be built upon those primal maps. So what we're hoping for is that the baby has a smooth experience in the womb, and that the baby has a smooth experience in the first 3 or 4 months, so that the baby can decide for herself what the important features in their environment are. And of course, what we're aware of is that doesn't happen for many babies. There are sometimes intrusions into the womb, drugs, mother being in a severe automobile accident or hospitalization, or the death of mother's mother, so that she goes into sadness and grieving. So there are many different unfortunate experiences that can and do happen to baby before birth. And then certainly in the first 3 or 4 months, there's all sorts of things, Holocaust conditions, food deprivation, rats in the crib, aggressive older brothers. There's all kinds of things, bad things that can happen. So what we're hoping is that the baby managed to get through the organizing period to where the baby can then begin to look and organize some good experiences in the attachment. And those of you that have studied attachment, you're aware that we have a secure attachment. Then we have 2 forms of insecure attachment where relationships have been intruded upon. And then we have the disorganized attachment. And the disorganized attachment almost always has its origin in a disorganized organizing experience. That is, there were intrusions and traumas during the organizing period, and they've not let the child move into a consistent attachment with mother, whether it's secure or insecure. How's that, Zilly?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. I like the way your English is getting good. You're saying organizing experience. Yay.
老师说你的英文变得越来越好，尤其是当你可以这么标准的说出 organize experience。
好的，好的。那你对我预期这么低，我肯定好了啊。
All right.
So I think now I am trying to organizing the perspective and theories from you and other theories I already learned in the past. So maybe I have some, I think I have a problem. So for example, in your theory, you mentioned the 3rd period as the self-other relational experiences. And I guess you integrate self-psychology theory. But I'm
yes.
Yeah. And so I think maybe in Kohut's theory, those kind of self-object needs happened from more earlier stage.
Yes.
So how can we integrate the 2 theories and why you only see that happens from 2 years old and 3 years old?
Okay, Lily, I'm not certain I understand your question, but let me try. If we think of this progression of relational complexity, then different things happen in any one of our lives during there, because we all have different families, different mothers, different fathers. So we build our relationship patterns or templates that we internalize. And so the way that we learn to internalize our mothers at the organizing level or the symbiotic level or the self-object level, we take those patterns into later life. So in a way, as I said earlier, this particular way of looking at things, the relational thing, is not a theory so much as an approach, a way of thinking about what's going on with our patients, no matter what theory we're using. We could be using DBT, CBT, EFT, because we choose a theory of psychology and a school of psychology because it makes sense to us, because it resonates with us. And so then we develop our own therapeutic technique according to that theory. And then as we grow, we bring other theories in. But this relational approach is a way of adding to whatever you're already doing in terms of thinking about, in this moment, in this hour, is this patient coming to me searching for a connection for me and then running away? Or is this person coming to me and then trying to get a connection going back and forth? And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And how do we think about that? So the relational approach could be used with any theory of psychology or psychotherapy. Did I answer your question, Lily? There's more.
Maybe not fully, but it's helpful.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Thank you.
Who's next?
Yeah, I have I don't know if it's a question or it's a confusion I've been thinking for a while. So because I'm working with a patient who might be the schizoid personality disorder.
Yes. Yes.
So I constantly feel that kind of non-relatedness feeling in our therapeutic relationship.
Yes.
And so, you know, when you are describing the organizing relationship experience, it feels like the patient would continually engage and disengage in a relationship. So my confusion is, will you think about there is some, I don't know, some relationship with the autistic features, or with the development phase of the organizing experience. And so that is the confusion, because sometimes I don't know if we even, I mean, under the relational approach perspective, is that proper, or is that always helpful for us to, you know, try to engage with such kind of patients? Because
Lily,
I feel that part is very difficult. Yeah.
And that's a wonderful question. And you'll notice that as I went through, I almost mentioned no diagnoses. That is, it seems like when we look at the history of psychiatric diagnoses, they've been a function of psychiatry, and they've expanded considerably. And we realize certainly in the United States, the American Psychiatric Association has had to fight off one lawsuit after another. And so the whole DSM has evolved to handle lawsuits for psychiatrists. And yet those of us who are not psychiatrists, you know, learned that system. And it's an interesting system, but I often call it Noah's Ark of mythical beasts. Does that make sense? We know what Noah's Ark is. Okay. When all the different animals went into Noah's Ark for the great flood. And I think of all of those creatures in the DSM as mythical beasts that are now filing into Noah's Ark. Some of them have horns of a giraffe, or, you know, all these different animal pieces. So you can go to the DSM, and on any page you open it up to, you can see that no description fits anybody living or dead. You know, the descriptions are abstract, they're artificial. But on the other hand, when you read through them, every page you can see yourself in all those diagnoses. So really, when we're looking at diagnoses, we have to realize that the diagnostic spectrum has evolved to serve medicine and psychiatry. And those of us that are non-medical, we're much more interested in other things. And at this point, our attention is shifting away from diagnosis and into studying relationships. Now, to your question of schizoid, because that's a really good question, and it's a great example. I told you that these 4 different levels are simply ways of listening. They don't necessarily describe anybody or any diagnosis, but they're, when we have an organizing experience in mind with your client, or symbiotic experience in mind, we want to say, well, how is he actually relating to you? Now, if he's coming to you, approaches you, and then as soon as it looks like you're going to get something going, he turns and runs, okay? It could be that he's working with an organizing experience, that he's longing for connection, but he's afraid. And so as we go forward, we'll talk about how we begin to encourage him to stay just a little longer, to trust us. So there's a whole set of techniques on how to work with him. But suppose that this person, that your patient you're talking about, developed a symbiotic relationship with his mother based upon touching and running, so that he and his mother learned to play that game. They learned how to set up a scenario. Now, then there's a different tactic that we would use, because we want to then work on being with him in the drama, the scenario that he's setting up. That he's not just approaching and running for fear of trauma, he's approaching and running as a way of engaging you, of getting you to relate to him with the chase and dodge kind of pattern, okay? And so a person that the DSM might describe as schizoid, you see, might be at either relational level or both, see? And so as therapists, we're not interested in the DSM description. We're interested in, what is this patient doing with us? How is this patient showing us the nature of his relational history? And like I say, it could be more primitive trauma at the organizing level, or it could be more a stylized form of connecting with mother, a schizoid character, if you will, because character is based upon a symbiotic interaction. So our question is, with each patient that's presenting a schizoid picture, is, what's he doing with us? What's going on there? How do we understand it? How do we connect with him? And how do we help him see what he's doing and begin to relax it? Okay. Those are the questions that we finally ask in therapy. Do we have some more, Sammy?
Yeah, is that more time for us to ask one
Hi,
more question?
Summer. Okay.
Okay. You quote Roy Schaefer, the changes happened in dialogue, in real or imagined relations with others. So can you give me an example about imagined relationship with others? Because, yeah.
The Christian church, the Buddhist temple, the gay community. That is, there's groups of people that get together and they have their own culture in there. And sometimes it's a question of, let's think of 2 women who've come together as partners, but they also have a community of women behind them that they're competing with or that they're imagining. And so one of them may be flirting with one of the other women and the other would be angry with her, or vice versa. And so when we're looking at triangles, there's real people that are a threat. And then there's the threat that this person is going to be more involved with church than they are with me. The person's going to be more involved with their moral system than they are with me. And so that's the idea of an imaginary or constructed third. Does that clarify it? It's a hard idea to get. Thank you, Summer. Do we have someone else? Sarah, were you going to give us a question?
I do. I just couldn't help to ask myself about the seven fears. I wondered, can we use that as a sort of like assumption in clinical work, or predict, for example, if a patient, firstly, he has fear of attachment, but gradually we found that he could attach the therapist.
Yes.
Afterwards, can we imagine, or can we predict that after that fear, he or she might come to the next fear, the fourth fear, like asserting self?
Oh, okay. Not necessarily. Very good question. Not necessarily, because this is not a lockstep thing. Maybe they come to the next one, but at the other level, the fourth level, the person might not have a problem. So I think we each one have a history of where in our relational development we had problems. And some of us at one level, some at another level. But because you're interested in fears, let me point you out to the free website or to Amazon. I've written a book on these fears, the 7 fears. And the name of the book is called Overcoming Our Relational Fears. And I go through the 7 and show how they look in a person's life, where they come from developmentally. And then I have a workbook next to it that allows us to work with our bodies, because fears exist in our body. So it's a body workbook, trying to locate in our body where these fears reside, so that we can begin to free ourselves. As you said, your patient in time began to give up the fear, but it was helpful to be able to see it as a fear. And also it's usually very helpful to see it as a fear that resides in some place in our body. And it's different with every person. You know, some people hold it in their throat, their jaw, their eyes, their fists, their stomach. And so fears are a part of our body development. And so look up those books, and I think you'll find there's a really good set of, and I had some body psychotherapists help me write that book. So it's knowledgeable from the standpoint of body work.
Oh.
Okay. Where are we, Sammy?
好的，那个因为时间原因，我们今天就到这里啊，谢谢拉瑞老师精彩的教学，谢谢各位老师参与讨论，那我们下周见啊。